Do not let him drink that. The warning came too late. 6-year-old Oliver Caldwell had already lifted Grace Parker's cup with both hands and swallowed the last mouthful of warm herbal milk. For one terrible second, the Royal Infirmary went silent. Grace froze beside the narrow bed, one hand still holding the cool cloth she had been pressing against Oliver's burning forehead. The young wolf pup stared back at her through fever-bright blue eyes, apparently unaware that he had just broken enough palace rules to terrify every healer in the room. "Oliver," Grace whispered. "That was mine." Chief Healer Margaret Sloane crossed the room quickly and took the empty cup. "What was in this?" "Warm milk, honey, chamomile, and feverfew," Grace answered. "I have had a mild fever since yesterday. The kitchen made it for me." Margaret's face tightened. "And you gave it to the royal heir?"
"No."
"He took it while I was reaching for water." "You should never have brought it near him." Grace opened her mouth, then stopped. Explaining herself would not change what everyone saw. She was an Omega servant standing beside the Alpha King's sick son with an empty cup that had never been approved by a royal healer. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in courage and destiny, hit like and subscribe. These stories remind us, love finds the broken. Now, back to Grace. Only 4 hours earlier, nobody in Caldwell Palace would have expected Grace Parker to matter. At 26, she worked behind the Royal Infirmary where important people rarely looked. She washed linens, organized dried herbs, carried meals, and sat with frightened wolf pups while certified healers handled everything considered important. Grace had learned not to resent being overlooked. Children noticed her. Animals noticed her. That had always been enough. That morning, Oliver had arrived pale and trembling after suddenly becoming ill in the royal garden. His fever climbed despite every careful treatment. He refused food, pushed away medicine, and became increasingly frightened whenever another unfamiliar healer approached. Alpha King Ethan Caldwell was nearly 50 miles away at a regional council meeting. Until he returned, the infirmary operated under strict protocol. Grace had been told to deliver fresh towels and leave. Then Oliver caught her sleeve. "Please stay." 2 words. Barely a whisper. Grace stayed. She told him stories about a stubborn gray wolf who believed every kitchen belonged to him. She replaced the cool cloth on his forehead. When his breathing became hurried, she counted slowly until he followed her rhythm. Eventually his grip loosened. Then he became thirsty. Grace turned toward the pitcher across the room. That was when Oliver saw her cup. Now, surrounded by horrified healers, Grace felt his small hand find hers again. Heavy footsteps sounded beyond the infirmary doors. Every conversation stopped. The doors opened, and Alpha King Ethan Caldwell entered wearing the dark coat he had traveled in, his brown hair still damp from the winter air. His blue-gray eyes found his son first. Then they moved to Grace. "What happened?" Margaret held up the empty cup. "Your Majesty, this Omega allowed Prince Oliver to drink an unapproved herbal mixture." Ethan's expression became unreadable. Grace felt Oliver tighten his fingers around hers. Then a healer beside the bed stared at the thermometer in disbelief. "Wait." Everyone turned. He checked it again. His voice dropped to a whisper. "His fever is falling." The thermometer changed the room. A moment earlier, every healer had been looking at Grace as though she were the problem. Now they stared at the number as if it had personally betrayed them. Margaret Sloane took the thermometer and checked it herself. 102.4, she said. Another healer opened the chart beside Oliver's bed. He was at 104.1 20 minutes ago. Ethan Caldwell moved to his son's side. He did not raise his voice or demand explanations. Somehow, his silence carried more weight than shouting ever could. "Oliver," Ethan said softly. The boy opened his eyes. "Dad." Relief flickered across Ethan's face before royal control returned. He touched the back of his hand to Oliver's forehead, then looked toward Margaret. "Is this improvement expected?" Margaret hesitated. "Not this quickly." Her gaze shifted toward Grace's empty cup. "But we cannot assume the drink caused it." "I did not say it did," Grace replied. Margaret frowned. Grace lowered her eyes, remembering her place, but Oliver's fingers were still wrapped around hers. Ethan noticed. What exactly was in the cup? He asked. Grace repeated every ingredient, including the small amount of honey the kitchen had added. Ethan listened without interrupting. Why were you drinking it? I have been running a mild fever since yesterday. His eyes sharpened. And you were working? Grace almost smiled at the question. People still need clean towels when an Omega has a cold. Something unreadable crossed Ethan's expression. Margaret stepped closer. Your Majesty, Grace should leave while we continue examining Prince Oliver. Oliver's grip tightened immediately.
No.
His voice was weak, but clear. Oliver, Margaret said gently. We need room to work. Grace stays. Grace crouched beside him. I will be right outside. Oliver shook his head. His breathing quickened. Grace felt the change before the monitors reflected it. Hey, she whispered. Look at me. Remember the gray wolf? Oliver swallowed. The kitchen thief? Exactly. What did he steal? Pancakes. How many? 7. 7 pancakes is unreasonable. He was hungry. The smallest smile appeared on Oliver's face. His breathing slowed. Ethan watched the exchange without speaking. Grace had no medicine in her hands, no royal training, no impressive title. She simply understood when his son was frightened. Margaret seemed to notice the same thing. We can examine him with her present, she conceded. Grace remained beside the bed while the healers checked Oliver carefully. His fever continued its gradual decline, but no one could explain why. The herbal milk contained nothing unusual, nothing dangerous, nothing strong enough to account for the sudden change. Perhaps the earlier treatment finally began working, one healer suggested. Margaret nodded, though she did not sound convinced. Ethan looked toward Grace. How long were you with him before I arrived? About 40 minutes. What happened before he became calmer? Grace thought carefully. Nothing important. Tell me anyway. She described the stories, the cool cloth, the breathing exercise, the water, and finally the accidental drink. Ethan listened to every detail. Then Oliver shifted beneath the blanket and whispered, My stomach hurts again. Margaret immediately reached for the medicine bottle on the nearby tray. Oliver turned his face away before she even opened it. Grace noticed. Not fear this time. Something else. Wait, she said. The word escaped before she remembered she was speaking to the chief royal healer. Margaret stopped. What? Grace looked at Oliver, then at the dark amber bottle. He did that earlier. Did what? Turned away before you gave him the medicine. Margaret's expression tightened. Children dislike medicine. I know. Grace hesitated. The room was watching her again. But he did not turn away from the cup. He turned away when he smelled that bottle. Ethan's gaze moved slowly toward the medicine. Oliver, he asked, does that smell make you feel sick? The boy nodded. Margaret stared at the bottle in her hand. Grace felt a cold uneasiness settle inside her. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. Ethan extended his hand. Do not give him another dose, he said. Not until we know why. For the next 20 minutes, the amber bottle sat untouched on the tray while the royal infirmary became quieter than Grace had ever known it. Margaret ordered a fresh sample of the medicine from storage and sent another healer to retrieve Oliver's treatment records. Ethan remained beside his son's bed, one hand resting near Oliver's shoulder, but his attention kept returning to Grace. She wished it would not. Being invisible had advantages. Invisible people were rarely blamed when King started asking questions. When did you first notice his reaction to the smell? Ethan asked. Before you arrived, Grace answered. He turned his face away when the bottle was opened. Margaret looked up from the chart. Why did you not mention it then? Grace hesitated. Because I did not know it mattered. The honest answer seemed to surprise her. Grace continued, I thought he simply disliked the medicine. Then he complained about his stomach immediately after smelling it again. Ethan nodded once.
No praise. No dismissal.
Just attention. Oliver stirred beneath the blanket. Grace. She stepped closer. I am here. Tell me about the pancake wolf. Grace smiled despite the tension. He has become extremely demanding. Did he steal more? This morning he stole syrup too. Oliver's tired laugh was barely louder than a breath, but Ethan heard it. His expression softened. Grace began another ridiculous story while the healers worked around them. She described the imaginary gray wolf sneaking into a roadside diner, wearing a baseball cap as a disguise and attempting to order 12 pancakes without money. Oliver corrected every detail he considered unrealistic, especially the number of pancakes. By the time the story ended, his breathing had settled again. Margaret checked his temperature. 101.8. Ethan released a slow breath. Grace felt some of the pressure leave the room. Then the healer, who had gone to storage, returned carrying a sealed bottle and several records. "The new bottle smells different," she said. Margaret immediately compared them. Grace watched her expression change. "Different how?" Ethan asked. "The original has a bitter, earthy scent beneath the syrup." Margaret turned toward Grace. "Is that what you noticed?" Grace leaned closer, without touching either bottle. The smell reached her almost immediately.
Familiar. Damp. Wrong.
She had smelled something similar days earlier while sorting herbs in the storage room. "I know that scent." Every face turned toward her. Grace swallowed. "There was a shipment of dried feverfew last week. One bundle smelled like wet leaves even though it was supposed to be dry. I marked it for disposal." Margaret frowned. Feverfew is used in several preparations, but not this syrup. "I know." Grace looked at the bottle. "That is why it seems strange." Ethan stood. "Where is the rejected bundle now?" Grace's stomach tightened. "It should be in the disposal cabinet." Margaret sent an assistant to check. Minutes later, the assistant returned. Empty-handed. "It is not there." Silence settled over the room again. Ethan's face did not change, but Grace felt the atmosphere sharpen. "Find the inventory record," he said. Warren Hale, the king's senior aide, appeared at the doorway carrying a folder that had been requested from the kitchen. "Your Majesty, there is something else." Ethan turned. Oliver ate lunch in the royal garden before he became ill. The kitchen preserved samples from the meal under palace safety protocol. Margaret straightened. "Send them for testing." Grace looked at Oliver. His eyes were closed now, his hand still resting near hers. Ethan followed her gaze. "You noticed what everyone else missed," he said quietly. Grace shook her head. "I noticed what Oliver was trying to tell us." For the first time, Ethan looked at her not as a servant who had accidentally become involved, but as someone whose presence had meaning. Then Warren opened the folder. "There is one problem. The missing herb bundle was signed out yesterday." Ethan's eyes hardened. "By whom?" Warren looked directly at Grace. "The record carries Grace Parker's name." Grace stared at the inventory sheet as though her name might rearrange itself if she waited long enough. It did not. Grace Parker appeared clearly beside the missing bundle, followed by a timestamp from 4:30 the previous afternoon. "I did not sign that out," she said. Margaret's expression became guarded. Warren checked the page again. "The storage record requires an employee identification number. Yours was entered correctly." Grace felt the room shift around her. Minutes ago, she had been the servant who noticed something important. Now she was the servant connected to a missing herb, an unusual medicine bottle, and a sick royal child. Ethan did not accuse her. Somehow, that made waiting worse. "Where were you at 4:30 yesterday?" he asked. Grace forced herself to think. "In the laundry room. We had an extra delivery of infirmary linens." Margaret folded her arms. "Can anyone confirm that?" "At least 6 people." Warren immediately stepped toward the door. "I will verify it." Grace looked at Ethan. "Your Majesty, I know how this appears."
So, don't eat.
His voice remained calm. "That is why I am asking questions instead of making conclusions." The answer steadied her more than reassurance would have. Behind them, Oliver shifted restlessly. His eyes opened, found Grace, then moved toward the unfamiliar healer approaching with another instrument.
No.
Grace turned. "It is all right, Oliver. Do not go." Margaret glanced toward Ethan. "Your Majesty, until we understand the inventory discrepancy, it may be safer for Grace to wait outside." Ethan's gaze moved from Grace to his son. For several seconds, Duty and instinct seemed to pull him in opposite directions. Grace gently loosened Oliver's fingers from hers. "I will be nearby." Oliver's breathing immediately quickened. "Grace." She stopped. Ethan saw it too. He looked at Margaret. Can anything she is doing from that chair interfere with his treatment? Margaret hesitated.
No.
Then she stays where I can see her. Grace returned to the chair, surprised by the exact wording. Ethan was not declaring her innocent. He was not ignoring the evidence. He was allowing facts to remain facts without turning suspicion into punishment. Oliver settled as soon as Grace sat beside him. She resumed the Pancake Wolf story in a low voice while the healers continued their work. 15 minutes later, Warren returned. 6 staff members confirmed Grace was in the laundry room from 3:50 until after 5 yesterday. The security log also shows her identification badge entering that wing and not leaving during the time the herb was removed. Margaret looked toward the inventory sheet. Then someone used her employee number. Grace exhaled, but relief lasted only a moment. Warren held up another document. There is more. The disposal cabinet has been malfunctioning for 2 weeks. Rejected supplies were temporarily moved to general storage yesterday morning. Grace stared at him. General storage? Beside the kitchen receiving area. Margaret's face changed. Then this may not involve deliberate tampering at all. Ethan turned toward her. Explain. If the rejected feverfew was moved without a clear quarantine label, someone could have returned it to usable stock by mistake. Warren nodded. And the kitchen records show an herb delivery was transferred to the Royal Garden Pantry yesterday afternoon. Grace remembered Oliver's lunch. Her stomach tightened. The food samples. Ethan looked toward the door. How long until the testing is complete? Less than an hour, Margaret said. Oliver stirred again and whispered, Dad. Ethan sat beside him. Grace watched the Alpha King's hand close gently around his son's. The frightening ruler everyone described beyond these walls was nowhere in that gesture. He was simply a worried father waiting for an answer. Oliver looked between them. Grace did not make me sick. Ethan's eyes met hers across the bed. I know what the evidence says so far. Grace understood the distinction and respected him for making it. Then Margaret's assistant hurried into the room carrying the preliminary report. We found the same contaminated plant residue in 2 places. Ethan stood. Where? The assistant swallowed. In Oliver's lunch sample and in the medicine bottle. The preliminary report changed the question. No one was asking whether Grace had caused Oliver's illness anymore. Now they needed to understand how the same contaminated herb had reached both his lunch and his medicine. Margaret read the report twice before looking toward Ethan. The concentration is low, but repeated exposure could explain why his fever kept rising despite treatment. Ethan's attention moved immediately to Oliver. And now, his temperature is 101.2. His breathing is steady, and his stomach discomfort is improving. Grace looked down at the boy. Oliver had fallen asleep with one hand curled around the edge of her sleeve. The sight brought relief, but it also left a question hanging over the room. Ethan looked toward the empty cup on the tray. What about what Grace brought? Margaret hesitated. The kitchen prepared it from a separate supply. We tested the remaining ingredients. They are clean. Did it lower his fever? We cannot prove that. Margaret chose her words carefully. The milk contained mild ingredients traditionally used for comfort during fever, but it was not an antidote. More likely, stopping the contaminated medicine prevented further exposure while hydration, rest, and his earlier treatment began helping his body recover. Grace was strangely grateful for the answer. She did not want a miracle assigned to her simply because everyone needed one. So I did not cure him, she said. Margaret looked at her. No. Then her expression softened. But you noticed his reaction when the rest of us were focused on his symptoms. That mattered. Ethan heard every word. Find out how the rejected herb returned to circulation. Warren nodded and left with 2 staff members. Within 40 minutes, the explanation began taking shape. A damaged label on the disposal container had made the rejected feverfew look like ordinary stock after supplies were temporarily moved. A kitchen assistant had returned it to the herb shelf, believing someone had misplaced it. From there, Portions reached both the garden pantry and the infirmary preparation room.
No hidden enemy.
No elaborate plot, just several small mistakes that had lined up badly. Ethan listened to the report without interruption. Change the storage procedure today, he said. Rejected supplies remain sealed and physically separated until disposal.
No exceptions.
Margaret nodded. Agreed. A younger healer approached Oliver's bed with a fresh cup of water and medication from a newly verified batch. Oliver woke and immediately pulled closer to Grace.
No.
It is safe now, Margaret assured him. Oliver shook his head. Grace could feel his fear returning.
She looked at Ethan.
May I show him first? Ethan nodded. Grace took the sealed bottle, checked the label in front of Oliver, then poured the measured dose while Margaret watched. Remember our pancake wolf? Grace asked. Oliver gave a suspicious nod. He says brave wolves ask questions before they eat mysterious things. Oliver looked at the medicine. Did he ask about the pancakes? Every single one. Were they safe? Extremely safe. Oliver considered this with 6-year-old seriousness. Then he accepted the medicine. Ethan watched his son relax almost immediately afterward. The younger healer reached forward to adjust the blanket and Oliver flinched. Ethan lifted one hand. Stop. The healer froze. Ethan looked at Grace. Stay beside him. Margaret began, Your Majesty, Grace is not trained to participate in treatment. I understand. Ethan's voice remained calm. You will handle his medical care. She will remain because he trusts her enough to let you do it. No one argued. Grace sat back down. Oliver closed his eyes, still holding her sleeve. Ethan took the chair on the opposite side of the bed. For several minutes, neither spoke. Then he said quietly, You could have defended yourself by blaming the healers. Grace looked across at him. They were trying to help him. Even when they suspected you? Being wrong about me does not make them bad at everything. Ethan studied her as though that answer had revealed something he had not expected to find. Outside, evening snow began drifting past the infirmary windows. Inside, Oliver slept peacefully between them. When Margaret returned an hour later, she checked the thermometer and smiled for the first time all day. 100.4. Ethan's shoulders finally eased. Grace smiled down at Oliver. Then his sleepy voice rose from beneath the blanket. Dad, I am here. Oliver opened one eye and pointed weakly toward Grace. Do not let them send her away. Ethan looked at Grace for a long moment. They will not. By sunrise, Oliver's fever had fallen below 100 degrees, but Grace had not left the chair beside his bed. She had tried twice. The first time, Oliver woke before she reached the door. The second time, Ethan quietly placed a cup of tea on the table beside her and said, You should probably stop pretending you are leaving. Grace looked at him over the rim of the cup. I have work. You have been awake all night. Those things can both be true. Something almost amused moved through Ethan's blue-gray eyes. Not today. Grace should have felt intimidated by an Alpha King giving her an order. Instead, she heard concern beneath it, and that was somehow more difficult to ignore. Oliver slept while morning light spread across the infirmary windows. Margaret arrived with the final laboratory report shortly after 7. We confirmed. The source, she said. Ethan stood immediately. Margaret placed the report on the table. The rejected feverfew was exposed to moisture during transport. It developed contamination that made Oliver ill. When the disposal label was damaged and the supplies were moved, the bundle was mistakenly returned to usable stock. Small amounts reached both his lunch seasoning and the syrup prepared afterward. Grace frowned. So the medicine kept giving him more of what had already made him sick. In very small amounts, yes. Margaret looked troubled. Each individual mistake seemed harmless. Together, they became the problem. Ethan read the report in silence. And Grace's employee number? Warren answered from the doorway. A storage clerk entered the identification number printed on the original rejection tag when transferring the bundle. The system recorded it as though Grace had personally signed it out. Grace finally released the breath she had been carrying since the previous afternoon. Ethan looked at her. Then the record clears her completely. Yes, Your Majesty. Grace expected relief to feel larger. Instead, she simply looked toward Oliver. He was awake now, listening with sleepy curiosity. "Does that mean I can have pancakes?" he asked. Margaret smiled. "If your stomach stays settled until breakfast." 7. Grace asked. Oliver gave her a serious look. "That is unreasonable." Ethan laughed quietly. The sound surprised everyone except Oliver. Later that morning, Grace accompanied Margaret to the storage room. She wanted to understand how the mistake had happened. Shelves rose nearly 10 feet along the walls, crowded with labeled jars, sealed packages, and dried herbs. Grace walked slowly past them until she stopped near a wooden crate.
"There," she said.
"That smell." Margaret leaned closer. A faint earthy odor lingered around several unopened packages from the same shipment. Her expression sharpened. "You can distinguish that?" "Only because I spend hours sorting these every week." Margaret studied Grace differently now. "Most people would call that unskilled work." Grace shrugged. "Most people do not notice how much skill goes into work they never have to perform." A voice behind them answered. "Perhaps they should." Ethan stood in the doorway. Grace straightened instinctively. "Your Majesty." He entered, looking at the shelves she had spent years organizing. "Margaret tells me you identified the first damaged bundle before anyone else." "I noticed a bad smell." "You noticed a warning." Grace shook her head. "Please do not turn me into something I am not. I am not a healer." Ethan stopped in front of her. "I know." The answer surprised her. "Then why are you here?" "Because I wanted to understand what you are." Grace raised an eyebrow. Ethan corrected himself. "What you do." That sounded less alarming. His mouth almost curved. "Barely." Before either could say more, Warren appeared with a message from the council. Several senior officials had heard about the incident. Questions were already spreading about why an untrained Omega servant had been permitted beside the royal heir. One council member had formally requested Grace be removed from the infirmary until her role could be reviewed. Grace felt the fragile warmth of the moment disappear. Ethan read the request once, folded it, and handed it back. "Tell them the review can happen." Warren waited. Ethan's gaze settled on Grace. "But she stays with Oliver." The council review began at noon in a chamber directly across from the Royal Infirmary, close enough that Grace could almost imagine Oliver's voice through the closed doors. She sat alone at one end of a long table, while 6 senior officials studied reports that described her as an untrained Omega employee. Ethan sat at the head of the table. He had offered no private reassurance before the meeting, and Grace was strangely grateful. She did not want protection that required everyone to ignore uncomfortable questions. Councilman Richard Mercer adjusted his glasses. "Miss Parker, you understand why this situation concerns us." "Yes." "You were present when Prince Oliver consumed an unauthorized drink." "He took my cup while I was reaching for water." "And your employee number appeared on the record connected to the contaminated herb." The investigation established why. Mercer tapped the report.
"Yet.
Somehow, every unusual event seems to place you beside the royal heir." Grace felt the accusation beneath the careful wording. Across the table, Ethan remained silent. For one painful second, disappointment touched her. Then she understood. He was letting her answer for herself. Grace folded her hands. "Then ask me what you actually want to know." Mercer blinked. "Excuse me? If you believe I caused Oliver's illness to make myself important, say it." The room became still. Mercer leaned back. "Did you?"
No.
Grace held his gaze. "And I do not want anyone to believe me because Prince Oliver likes me, or because the Alpha King allowed me to stay. Believe the laboratory reports. Believe the security records. Believe the 6 laundry workers who confirmed where I was. If the evidence says I did something wrong, hold me responsible. If it does not, then my being an Omega should not become evidence by itself." Ethan's expression barely changed, but something warm entered his eyes. Margaret Sloane opened the medical file. "The evidence is clear. Grace Parker did not introduce the contaminated feverfew into circulation. She was the employee who originally identified the damaged shipment and marked it for disposal. She also noticed Prince Oliver's reaction to the compromised medicine, which led us to stop further exposure." Mercer looked toward Ethan. Even so, allowing an unlicensed employee to remain involved in royal treatment creates a dangerous precedent. She is not providing medical treatment, Ethan said. Chief Healer Sloan is. Then why must Miss Parker remain? Before Ethan could answer, the infirmary door across the corridor opened. A young healer hurried inside. Your Majesty, Prince Oliver is asking for Grace. Margaret rose. Is something wrong? His condition is stable, but he became anxious when he realized she was gone. Ethan looked at Grace. Go. Mercer objected. The review is not finished. Grace stayed seated. Then finish it. Ethan's gaze returned to the councilman. You wanted evidence. Let us discuss evidence. He lifted Margaret's report. The certified healers treated my son's illness. Grace Parker noticed what frightened him, recognized a smell others overlooked, and kept him calm enough to accept care. Those facts do not compete with medical expertise. They complement it. Margaret nodded. I agree. The words carried more weight than Grace expected. Mercer studied the report one final time. Then I withdraw my request for her removal. Grace released a slow breath. Ethan did not smile. He simply closed the file. Good. Minutes later, Grace returned to the infirmary. Oliver was sitting upright for the first time, eating half a pancake under Margaret's supervision. You left, he complained. I had a meeting. Was it boring? Grace glanced back through the open doorway, where Ethan had just appeared. Extremely. Oliver considered this, then tore off a tiny piece of pancake. You can have some. Generous. Ethan approached the bed. Oliver looked between them, apparently satisfied that both were present. Margaret checked his temperature. 99.1. If this continues, he can return to his rooms tomorrow. Relief softened Ethan's face. Then Margaret turned to Grace. I owe you an apology. Grace looked surprised. For what? I saw your lack of credentials before I saw your judgment. Grace shook her head. You were protecting him. So were you. Ethan watched Grace absorb those words as though recognition made her more uncomfortable than criticism ever had. Later, when another healer entered to prepare Oliver for his evening examination, the boy immediately reached for Grace. Ethan noticed and moved his chair closer. She stays, he said. This time, nobody questioned why. Oliver returned to his own rooms the next morning wearing blue pajamas, carrying the stuffed gray wolf Grace had found in a storage closet, and giving instructions as though recovery had promoted him to chief healer. The curtains stay open, he announced. Breakfast has pancakes. Grace sits there. He pointed to the chair beside the window. Margaret hid a smile. Ethan did not. You appear to have developed strong administrative opinions, he told his son. Oliver nodded seriously. I learned from you. Grace looked away before Ethan caught her laughing. For the first time since Oliver became ill, the room felt ordinary. His temperature had remained normal through the night. His appetite was returning. The verified medication had been discontinued once Margaret confirmed it was no longer necessary, and the contaminated supplies had been removed from every palace storage area. New procedures were already in place. Grace should have felt that her role was finished. Instead, when she stood to return to the laundry wing, Oliver immediately looked worried. Where are you going? Back to work. This is work. Apparently I have been promoted without paperwork. Ethan, standing near the fireplace, studied her. That can be corrected. Grace's smile faded. I was joking. I was not. Before she could answer, Margaret entered with 2 healers for Oliver's final examination. One approached the bed with a medical bag. Oliver's shoulders tightened. Grace noticed before anyone else. Ethan noticed Grace noticing. Tell me what happens first, Oliver said. The healer paused. Margaret answered gently, explaining each simple step before it happened. Oliver listened, then reached for Grace's hand. Stay. Grace sat beside him. The examination proceeded without difficulty. When it ended, Margaret closed the chart. Healthy temperature. Normal breathing.
No stomach discomfort.
I would like another day of rest, but medically, he is doing very well. Oliver smiled. Ethan released a breath that sounded as though he had been holding it for 2 days. The younger healer reached toward Oliver's arm to check one final reading without warning him. Oliver pulled back. Ethan raised his hand. Stop. The healer froze. Ethan's voice remained calm. Explain what you were doing first. The healer did. Oliver relaxed. Grace looked at Ethan and realized he had been paying attention to more than test results. He had learned his son's fear had meaning. After the healers left, Ethan asked Grace to walk with him. They stopped in a quiet hallway overlooking the snow-covered garden. I want you transferred from laundry duty, he said. Grace folded her arms. To what? The infirmary. I am not a healer. You have mentioned that. Repeatedly. Ethan almost smiled. Then I will repeat myself. I am not asking you to become one. He looked through the window towards several young wolf pups playing below. Oliver accepted treatment because someone made him feel safe enough to cooperate. We have excellent medical staff. What we do not have is anyone whose responsibility is helping frightened children through the experience. Grace became quiet. That was different. Ethan continued. Margaret supports the idea. And what would my title be? I hoped you might tell me. Grace stared at him. You are offering me a job that does not exist. You seem unusually skilled at noticing things that do not exist yet. She tried not to smile. That sounded almost like a compliment. It was dangerously close. A small laugh escaped her. Ethan's expression softened at the sound. Then Oliver came running carefully down the corridor with Margaret several steps behind him. Grace. He reached them and took her hand. Then, with the absolute confidence of a 6-year-old solving an obvious problem, he grabbed Ethan's hand too and placed it over hers. Grace went still. Warmth moved through her palm, quiet but unmistakable. Ethan felt it too. His blue-gray eyes lifted to hers. Somewhere beneath his practiced control, the alpha wolf inside him became strangely, completely calm. Oliver looked between them.
See, he said.
Better. For 3 days after Oliver returned to his rooms, Grace kept expecting life to settle back into something familiar. It never did. The laundry supervisor had already reassigned her schedule, Margaret had cleared a small office beside the pediatric treatment rooms, and someone had placed a handwritten sign on the door that read Child Comfort Coordinator. Grace stared at it for nearly a minute before Ethan appeared beside her. You dislike the title. It sounds like I coordinate comfortable children. You suggested I let you define the position. I did. That was your first mistake. Ethan smiled, and the quiet warmth between them returned. Neither had mentioned what happened when Oliver placed their hands together. Grace still remembered it too clearly. The sudden warmth. The strange stillness. The way Ethan had looked at her as though his wolf recognized. Something his mind was not ready to name. But he had not claimed fate as an excuse to move closer. He had given her space. Somehow, that mattered more. Grace spent the next week building the program she wished Oliver had possessed from the beginning. Children were told what would happen before examinations. Parents could remain whenever possible. A shelf filled with books, puzzles, and stuffed animals replaced an empty cabinet. Grace trained staff to recognize fear before mistaking it for stubbornness. Margaret supported every practical change. Soon, even the most skeptical healers began asking Grace to sit with nervous pups before treatment. One afternoon, Grace found Ethan watching from the doorway while she helped a frightened little girl choose which arm Margaret should examine first. Afterward, he followed Grace into the hall. You were right, he said. About what? Care is not only what happens medically. Grace studied him. That sounded suspiciously humble for an Alpha King. Do not tell the council. She laughed. Ethan's expression softened, but then became serious. There is something I need to ask you. Grace waited. I offered you this position because you earned it. Not because Oliver became attached to you, and not because of whatever happened between us in that hallway. Her heartbeat changed at the words. Ethan continued. If you want this work, it is yours. If you do not, you can walk away without owing my family anything. Grace understood what he was really offering.
Choice.
I want the work, she said. Good. And I am still deciding what I think about the other thing. Ethan nodded. So am I. It was the safest answer he could have given, and somehow the most intimate. That evening, Oliver joined them in the infirmary garden for his final follow-up. He had been officially cleared, which he celebrated by requesting 7 pancakes for dinner. Grace reminded him that 7 remained unreasonable. 6. Negotiable. Oliver grinned and ran ahead toward the fountain. Ethan walked beside Grace beneath the winter lights. Their hands brushed accidentally. The same warmth returned, softer this time. Neither pulled away immediately. Ethan's wolf settled into that impossible calm again, and Grace felt something inside her answer, not with urgency, but recognition. Ethan looked at her. You felt that. It was not a question. Yes. Oliver turned around from 20 feet away. Are you two being weird again? Grace laughed. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Apparently, Oliver hurried back and slipped one hand into Grace's and the other into his father's. Better, he declared. Ethan looked down at his son, then across at Grace. Days earlier, everyone in the palace had known her only as an Omega who carried towels and sorted herbs. Now frightened children asked for her by name, healers respected her judgment, and the Alpha King trusted her with the person he loved most. Grace squeezed Oliver's hand. Whatever the moon intended between her and Ethan could wait. For once, destiny was not demanding anything from either of them. It was simply standing beside them, warm and quiet, while they chose what came next.